Tonight we're going to take a look at the Ramayana, which is one of the most important works of literature that comes out of ancient India. Compared to something like the Iliad, which has had a huge impact on Western civilization, Western literature, the Ramayana has likewise had a big impact on Indian literature, but it is also a living tradition. Okay, where the Iliad is tied into the paganism of the ancient Greek world, which has long since disappeared, the Ramayana is still part of the living religion of India today, which is Hinduism. And in the course of this presentation, we're going to actually talk a little bit about the background of India. We haven't dealt with India yet in the mythology, so I want to take a little bit of time to introduce you to ancient India, talk to you a little bit about Hinduism, at least as far as a particular Hinduism is concerned, because Hinduism is kind of a complicated subject, and it's an umbrella term that actually includes lots of different belief systems underneath that term. So to say this is what Hindus believe is really an overstatement, and you can't really get away with that, because you'll find sects within Hinduism that totally disagree. They don't believe what you said at all. So I'm going to go through and give you a little bit of an overview, and I'll try to cover the bigger picture within Hinduism. But we're going to start with a look at ancient India. So let's take a look at the Ramayana. The historical setting, let's start there. This is always a good place to start when you haven't been introduced to the culture at all. And we can go back kind of to the way beyond or way before the period that we can refer to as the Hindu period, into what was called the Indus River Valley Civilization, which goes back to at least 2600 BC. And it obviously arose in the Indus River Valley. And the civilization has gone by different names. Modern archaeologists sometimes have called it the Harappan civilization, based on the site of Harappa. The Indus River is right there for the most part, though it branches into different directions. It's ultimately what separates the subcontinent of India from the region to the east, to the west, which is basically the Persian realm. As a matter of fact, I'll get to that a little bit maybe later. Anyways, around 2000 to 1700 BC, this civilization starts to decline. Right there is the city of Harappa. Another big city, Mohenjo-Daro, is on the other part of the river. Those are the two most famous sites of this early civilization. And it was pretty advanced as far as their architecture, plumbing. They didn't really leave written records that we can read or anything like that, but it was very well developed. Unfortunately, it does decline, as most civilizations do. It's hard to find a civilization that lasts forever, but the reasons for its decline have been speculated at for quite a while. Originally, people believed it might be due to immigrations of new people, who we're about to discuss, known as the Aryans. But most of the scholars today, I think, lean towards a decline due to the climate, geography, or geological changes, such as the fertility of the region, the rivers maybe changing course, a decline in productivity, things like that. But whatever the cause, you do have a migration of people in, okay? It might not be a conquest, but there's a migration of people that basically come from the northwest. These are known as the Aryan peoples. Now, the term Aryan has a reputation today, mostly because of the 20th century view, particularly associated with people like Adolf Hitler, the master race, that kind of idea. When we think of the word Aryan today, you get this idea of the Nordic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. That is not what the Aryans are historically. The Aryan peoples, which is related to, again, Indo-European language-speaking groups, have various physical characteristics as far as skin color, hair color, stuff like that. So you've got these Aryan peoples, these tribes, moving into India around 1700 to 1300. They're basically nomadic herdsmen and stuff like that, and they're bringing with them a religion that is primarily centered around the Sky Father figure. Okay, and they're going to displace some of the earlier groups that are there. Most of these groups are often referred to as Dravidian, which are pushed further south into India. Okay, these might be the earlier peoples of the Indus River Valley. You also have groups, migrating in the other direction that are eventually going to the region of Persia and into Europe that are also Aryan in background. The word Aryan, by the way, means noble. Okay, so again, this gives you a little bit of an idea that these people viewed themselves as kind of a class above maybe some of the people that they're displacing or intermingling with. Now, this period is going to be associated with some writings that are known as the Vedas. Okay, basically from 1500 to about 1200 BC is the early Vedic period. We've got the composition, right, or the development of what's known as the Rig Veda. These are the early hymns to the gods. This is religious text, and the Rig Veda is probably the most important of the early religious texts of India, and has a particular place even today among religious literature in Hinduism. Now, these gods, like I said, are basically sky father figures and various other gods. It's a polytheistic religion that essentially worships, I think, like 33 gods. Okay, some of them would be gods like Varuna and Mitra, Indra, Agni. You also see gods like Vishnu and Rudra or Shiva show up in this pantheon. Okay, but there's an evolution of religion. By the time we get to the late Vedic period of 1200 to 600 BC, you have more migrations now from the Indus River eastward towards the Ganges River, and Ganges River is going to be one of the most sacred places in all of India. The whole river is a sacred river. From 1100 to 900, other Vedas are composed. And again, this is oral composition. These are not written down at this time, right? They're orally composed. The Sama Veda, the Yajurveda, Atharva Veda. And then over this time, you also have other reflections on these poems and these hymns that are added or appended to those works. So you're going to have the Brahmanas, basically composed by the priestly caste, the Brahmins. Okay, the Aranyakas, which are reflections by people that are kind of the forest dweller people. And then the Upanishads, which are really the philosophical speculations related to the Vedas. So all of these are reactionary works to the Vedas, reflections, commentaries, and things like that are appended to it. So it makes this huge body of work, right? Anyways, the other thing that's developing during this time is the Varna system. I'm going to talk about the Varnas in a little bit, but that's a caste system or a class system within India. Okay, so there are different levels of society, very, very rigidly structured. So we're talking at the top, the Brahmins, which I just mentioned, right? The priests. Then you've got the Kshatriya, which are the warriors and kings. The Vaishya, and then the Shudra, and then below the four Varna, because there's four ultimate Varna, below that you've got the ones that are essentially outcasts, the Dalits, the ones that are not part of the system at all. They would have been probably the earlier pre-Aryan groups. Okay, now what I'm going to go to next is really a look at Hinduism, okay, as it evolves. So around 600 BC, we can consider that point onward the Hindu period. All right, it's an evolution from the Vedic period, and part of the change is going to be due to the Upanishads, the philosophic reflections and the changes in thought within India. So I want to talk about what the Upanishads did to Indian thinking. All right, so let's talk first polytheism. Clearly, the earlier Vedic period was a polytheistic system, probably like a lot of other polytheistic groups. Lots of gods of nature. And then we want to introduce the other two terms that you see on the screen, pantheism and monotheism. Monotheism is the idea that there's one ultimate being of some sort. Pantheism, I don't want to say is a middle ground between them, but pantheism is the idea or concept that all of reality is God. That God is in all things, almost the idea that everything that exists is somehow a manifestation of the divine or the great ultimate. Okay. Now, there are Hindus today that will be happy to be called polytheists. There are other Hindus that classify themselves as monotheists, and then others that would prefer the term pantheist. Okay. So these are all possibilities, which is why I said Hinduism is kind of a complicated topic as far as a religion goes. Like I said, it's an umbrella term. The Upanishads, which are these reflections on the Vedas, are what leads to a number of schools that are called Vedanta. Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas, because when these appendices were added to the Vedas, the Upanishads was the last piece added. So these are literally the last part of the Vedas, the last appendices, or the appendix. So that's where Vedanta schools come from. And there's a lot of different schools of Vedanta. Now, within Hinduism, not everybody that's a Hindu belongs to a Vedanta school. There are, like I said, other groups. But I want to focus on the major view that comes out of really what's called Advaitic Vedanta. Okay, now there's Dvaita Vedanta, which is the idea of a dualistic school, which means you've got the concept of the ultimate, and then you've got the concept of a distinction between the ultimate and that which is dependent on the ultimate. Okay, so a distinction between kind of a created reality and the source of that reality. You've got Advaitic Vedanta, which I just mentioned. That's basically non-dualistic Vedanta, which takes the position that everything that exists is really just the ultimate. Okay, it's not really real. The idea of Maya you may have heard of, which is this illusion. The true reality is what's called Brahman. Okay, and then you've got Vishishtadvaita, which is a modified, non-dualistic approach, which recognizes the distinction between the ultimate and the manifestation, but ultimately there is a unity behind all of that. I'm definitely oversimplifying. Okay, and there are a lot of big Indian thinkers behind these, like Shankara in the Advaitic system, Ramanuja. These are really, really powerful thinkers that maybe even rival great names in the West like Plato and Aristotle. All right, they're careful thinkers, and they develop an entire system of belief from the Upanishads. Anyways, Brahman, that term refers to the ultimate reality. So you can think of that as, in a sense, God, but in a sense, I don't want to make it sound like a personal being of any sort. I mean, if you come from a monotheistic tradition like Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, you tend to think of God as a person, right, with a personality, will, and things like that. Brahman is ultimate reality. It's divine. It's eternal. It is both the material and efficient cause of everything that exists, to use a Aristotelian term. So if you want to know what a material cause for something is, it's basically what it's made out of, right? So if I'm talking about the desk that I'm sitting at, the material cause of that desk could be the wood, the metal, the things that are go into building the desk. An efficient cause would be the thing that brings it into existence, like the guy that builds the desk from the first place. Now, when you talk about all of reality being Brahman, and that Brahman is the material and efficient cause for everything, we're saying all of reality is itself Brahman and is caused by Brahman, brought into existence by Brahman. So that would mean you, me, the desk I'm sitting at, the tree out in the yard, whatever. Those are all Brahman, right? So that's this idea of absolute non-duality. There's only one thing that exists. We may think there's diversity, but ultimately everything is one. Now, another term that's worth noting is Atman, okay, which is the soul, the self, or the existence. And that is ultimately identical to Brahman, okay, for the Advaitic Vedanta follower. So for that viewpoint, each individual person is a soul, and you are at the same time Brahman. And that's actually one of the great realizations in Advaitic Vedanta, is that you are that, okay? Thou art that. It's kind of one of those catchphrases in the system, that once you realize your identity with the ultimate, that's the key to ultimate salvation, though I want to be careful if I use the word salvation. I don't want to make it sound like this is some kind of Christian philosophy. But that's the idea of the Atman. And along with it, you're going to have this idea of karma. So what happens with a soul is you act, you do things, you behave in a certain way throughout your life. Now, karma is the word that refers to our deeds, our acts. And I think you've all heard of karma. It's one of the most famous terms in the West as far as deriving from India. And it's the idea of cause and effect for the most part, right? We think of karma as what goes around comes around, right? You do something bad, you get something bad. You do something good, you get something good. Karma in certain sects within India is always a negative thing. It's the idea of accumulating a debt for your activity, right? If you do something bad, this kind of karma, these deeds attach itself to the Atman, to the soul, to the actor or agent. And the problem that emerges from the accumulation of karma, or the incrustation of karma on one's Atman, is that you get stuck in what's called the wheel of samsara. Okay, this is the cycle of rebirth, the idea of transmigration of the soul. So when you die, you'll be reborn again. And the reason you need to be reborn again is so that Atman, that soul, can work off, or at least has the opportunity to work off the karma that has stuck it here in this cycle. That's why the wheel is a symbol here. As a matter of fact, the wheel is a symbol of Buddhism, because Buddhism also derives out of Hinduism and is also attached to this idea of transmigration of the soul. So anyway, samsara is what you want to escape. It's what you want to get out of. Now, let me draw the picture a little bit more fully so you understand how this works out as a system. Let's go back to the Varna, the different castes. And when I use the word caste, that's actually not quite appropriate. Most people think of India as having castes, and there being 4 castes. It's appropriate to say there's 4 varna, but within each varna, there are lots of different castes. So caste has to do maybe with a subdivision of class within the greater classifications of class. So the Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Okay, so you've got the priests, you've got the warrior kings, you've got the skilled laborers, and then you've got the lower laborers at the very bottom. Now, think of reincarnation as bringing the soul through like a chain, or maybe a ladder upward. Okay, at least that's the idea. So if you're born, let's say, as a kshatriya, you're born in the warrior caste. You have, and maybe I should give one more definition to make sure that you understand what we're about to talk about. So let's introduce the word dharma. And as a matter of fact, I have dharma illustrated a little bit differently than the other text on the board for one really big reason, is dharma is the main theme of the story tonight. All right, so when we get to the Ramayana, that is one of the big things you want to get out of it, is what exactly are they trying to teach you about dharma? All right, so dharma has to do with our duties, has to do with virtue, has to do with proper action. It's the idea that there's a certain way that you're supposed to live your life according to your class, according to your spot in society. It's not just the idea that, you do good and that's all there is to it. No, there are boundaries, there are limits, there are rules. It's very rigidly defined. As a matter of fact, the laws of Manu include all the different rules as far as what kinds of occupations you could have, what kinds of food you can eat, what kinds of dress, who you can interact with, who you can't interact with. You can never, marry outside of your varna. There's all kinds of, people that would be untouchable, that, contaminate you, and all kinds of things that violate the proper bounds of dharma. So let's go back now to the kshatriya. Say you're a kshatriya, you're a warrior, and you do your task. Your duty as a warrior is to do war. You have certain people you can marry. You have certain things you can eat, etc. Now, when you die, if you have lived according to dharma, you will have, without violating the rules of dharma, you will have potentially paid off some of the karma that was attached to your soul when you came into this life, right? So whatever karma you had, the very fact that you exist now tells you that you have karma attached to your Atman, because if you didn't, you wouldn't exist right now. The fact that you are here is because you've been reincarnated from a previous existence due to karma attached to that soul. So if I live my life properly here, live according to Dharma, when I die, the idea is if I've paid off enough of that karma, my next birth will be higher up on the chain, higher up on the hierarchy. Okay, so maybe I'll be born not as a kshatriya, I may be born as a brahmin. Okay, but like I said, it's subdivided. So maybe if I was at the very top of the kshatriya class, I would be born in the very bottom of the brahmin class. And that might take a number of lives to then continue to pay off the karma so that you will eventually be born as a highest class or caste brahmin. Okay, now of course, if you are at the top, you could also potentially accumulate karma. If you don't live according to dharma, you can end up walking backward down the chain. So next life, maybe you're going to be born at a lower spot, right? We don't ever really know because nobody remembers their past lives. So I don't know if I've gone up or down. So my duty is really to try to live as best I can according to dharma so that, the future is at least brighter down the road. Incidentally, if you are an upper class Brahmin at the very top of the food chain and you're a female and live according to Dharma your entire life, do everything perfectly, it doesn't mean you're done with the reincarnation process. You still have to be reincarnated as a Brahmin male because it's only the Brahmin men at the top that actually get to escape. And the idea of escape, by the way, is what's called moksha. Moksha is the liberation from the wheel of samsara. It's when the Atman becomes one again with Brahman, which is what it always was. It's just been separated temporarily. I love the illustration that's given where you see kind of a picture of the sea, right? The waters swirling around and kind of if you've ever been to the beach or the sea and you see like the spray coming off of, the water, these little droplets that fly up into the air. The illustration or the analogy is that these little droplets are individual souls, like the Atman, the individual personal Atman. And what happens after they fly off and are for a moment distinct and individual, they fall back into the sea and back into the water, and they become all one again. There's no more differentiation. And that's the idea of moksha. Your soul is just absorbed back into the ultimate right? There's no more personal independent existence or consciousness. And this is what is hoped for. So that's kind of the viewpoint in Advaitic Vedanta as far as the idea goes. And it's a really complicated system, as you can imagine. Like I said, with the rules and with these cycles of rebirth, if you ever study more Hindu mythology or Indian mythology, you're going to see the idea of the kind of the recurring universe, the Mahayuga, the creation idea that we're going through different ages and everything repeats again, almost ad infinitum. There are ends of some of these cycles, but the cosmic process is so vast. This is almost like an infinity of just rebirth and recycling of everything over and over again. So it's really kind of cool. In my usually when I teach the course, years ago, I used to do a lot more creation myths. So you'd do some of the Indian stuff as far as creation goes. Some accounts from the Rig Veda and the Upanishads and things like that. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I would point you in that direction. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is actually pretty good for a creation story that deals with this kind of stuff. But let's move on. With that background in mind, now that you've got the concept of Dharma, I think we can take a look at introducing the Ramayana. All right, so let's first talk about the composition. When it was composed, when it reflects, what period of time it reflects. Most likely the setting for the story would be somewhere around 1200 to 1100 or 1000 BC. That would be the historical setting based on things we see in the text, right? The family, for instance, of Rama and Sita seem to represent the cultured peoples of North India from that time period, which may indicate that the story originally started to develop that far back. Of course, it wasn't written down that far back. It was going to be written down much, much later. So there would be an oral tradition until we get to a written version that is going to be produced, different strands probably coming together between 200 BC and AD 200. So you got a 400-year window. Now, the poet who is associated with the composition of the Ramayana, or at least the version that you have in your textbook, is a guy by the name of Valmiki. This is a Sanskrit epic. He is the great poet. He's like the Homer of ancient India. And he was possibly actually associated with some of those northern portions of India, like Ayodhya and Kosala, which are some of the kingdoms mentioned in the story, right? The kingdoms of Rama's family and Sita's family. Now, Valmiki also compiled other works, and there are other tales that he's given credit for as well. As far as the story goes, the core story dates to around this time period. The first and last part of the story, which would be the first and seventh chapters, the Bala Uttara Kanda, were added probably around AD 400. That's speculation, right? And these are the chapters that are kind of distinct in that they're going to give you the picture of Vishnu and his incarnation as the avatar Rama. Okay, you actually see Vishnu appear in chapter 1 and in chapter 7 of the work. So there's clearly a distinction between what goes on in the core part of the story and what was in the beginning and ending, right? Kind of like a bookend. Doesn't mean it's necessarily developed the way some scholars think it was developed, but you also have Valmiki show up at the end of the book as well. In chapter 7, he is there teaching the sons of Rama, Lava and Kusha, basically the song of Rama. So that's also an interesting thing added probably later, okay? So again, this is one version. There are many other versions, many other recensions, many other editions of the story. And it's been interesting teaching this over the years because I've had a number of Hindu students over the years that have, been in my class and have shared different versions of the story with me, different things I hadn't heard before. And it's always good to be able to interact with students and learn some of the different traditions, how the story is, still alive today in the culture, for instance, as well. But some of these other stories are really very different versions. So, for instance, one of the most famous alternative versions of the Ramayana is the one by Tulsidas, and this goes back to really the 16th century. All right, he was born around 1497. And he's a Vaishnavite poet, which means he was dedicated to the god Vishnu. The Vaishnavites are those that are dedicated to Vishnu. Okay, it's a particular branch within Hinduism. And he was also what's called a Bhakta of Rama. A Bhakta is a person who is devoted to a particular being, and Rama was the being he was devoted to. There are different paths, by the way, to salvation within Hinduism. If you take us like a bhakti path, the idea of a devotion, that's one way that you could ultimately attain moksha is through devotion to a particular deity. Anyways, the Ramcharitmanas was an Awadhi Hindi version of the Ramayana that was composed by Tulsidas. It's about 1/3 the length of Valmiki's Ramayana. Okay, so it's much shorter. The tradition is also that Tulsidas is a reincarnation of Valmiki, which I guess would make a lot of sense if you are Hindu, right? You believe in reincarnation, so here's a guy who very well could be the reincarnation of the great poet Valmiki, because he too is a great poet. And his basic perspective as a Bhakta of Rama is he taught devotion towards Rama as the way to attain moksha. Okay, if you want to attain moksha, then you devote yourself to Rama. Now, Rama is going to be, I'll talk about in a second, a little bit different than the Rama of the Ramayana as far as the religious view of Tulsidas, but hold off and I'll tell you a little bit about that. There's a Tamil version, which is by the writer Kampan, and a Bengali version by Kritibas. There's a number of others in addition to these. So this is just 4 more famous versions. Okay, so if you were to want to read the authentic Ramayana, not just the one in your textbook, then go to a good bookstore. You can probably find the Ramayana pretty easily, but you could check and see which version you're getting, right? If you want Valmiki's version, it's of course the original or the most famous of the versions. All right, let's talk about Vishnu. Vishnu has a real big role to play in the story. Vishnu is one of what are known as the Trimurti. He was a god that's mentioned all the way back in the Vedas, in the earlier polytheistic phase. Once we get into the Hindu phase, you have not only more gods added to the pantheon, you go from 33 to like 33 million gods, or really an infinite number of gods for the most part, but there are 3 that really stand out. They're called the Trimurti, or the 3 faces, and that would be Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, or Shiva Rudra. Okay? Now, back in the Vedic period, Vishnu is a god of the light. He was associated with the sun. I said the majority of the gods were actually associated with the sky in some way. So Surya would be one of the sun gods. Dyaus would be a sun god, a sky god. Vishnu too, associated with light. The Trimurti I just mentioned, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Rudra. Be careful that you don't confuse Brahma, the creator, with Brahman, the ultimate. Okay? Brahma would be a manifestation of Brahman, but they're not the same. Okay, so Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and then Shiva Rudra is the destroyer. They kind of represent, in a way, past, present, future, different states in a transition within this great cycle, okay, of creation, life, death, and rebirth. Vaishnava, in that particular sect, remember those are the ones that are dedicated to Vishnu, they actually view Vishnu as the supreme ultimate. So they would put Vishnu in the place of Brahman. Right, so when they talk about Vishnu, they're talking about the ultimate being. All right, so again, different from other sects. The Bhagavata Purana says Vishnu has innumerable avatars. Now, what an avatar is, I have a tendency to want to say an incarnation of the god, but you got to be careful again because the word incarnation brings certain ideas with it, particularly from Judeo-Christian tradition, and an avatar in Hinduism or India is a little bit different. It's a physical manifestation of a god, but there are different qualities or qualifications. So anyways, there are about 22 avatar of Vishnu listed in the Bhagavata Purana. Traditionally, there are 10 that are the most famous avatars. So if you ask people how many avatars does Vishnu have, a lot of times you're going to come up with the number 10. That's what's known as the Dasavatara. Dasavatara. My language is not exactly what I want it to be. All right, so the 10 avatars of Vishnu, and their purpose is to restore Dharma, okay, to restore the universe into the proper balance. That's what's according to the Mahabharata, which is the great, great epic poet of ancient India. One of I think, the largest epic poet in the world, poem in the world. Anyways, let's look at the 10 avatars briefly. I'm not going to tell you stories about all of these, but there are stories that go with each of these manifestations. So Vishnu has taken the form first of Matsya, the fish. This goes back to the story of the Great Flood and the character Manu, who is basically the Indian version of Noah. So Matsya, which is the fish man for the most part, kind of a combination. You've got Kurma, the tortoise, kind of upholds the cosmos on his back. It's another story with the churning of the cosmic ocean and the quest for immortality kind of built into that story. Varaha, the boar. Then you've got Narasimha, the man-lion. You've got Vamana, the dwarf. That's actually a cool story. I like the story of Vamana, maybe the best out of all of them. There was demons that show up in Hindu mythology quite often. We'll see one in the Ramayana very shortly. There's actually a number of demons in the Ramayana. But demons aren't always bad. Demons could be good. But they're still demons. And there's this one demon, I believe Bali, or something Bali, is a very powerful being in the story who has taken possession from the gods of the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. And the gods want those things returned to them, so they go to Vishnu, and Vishnu decides he's going to take the form, the avatar of the dwarf, Vamana. And he's going to go and ultimately confront Bali. And ultimately you get this idea where Bali offers him to give him whatever land he should be able to cover within 3 steps. It was kind of the deal that's worked out. So Vishnu, Vamana, is going to take 3 steps, and whatever he covers will be his. And immediately, using his power, he grows into this giant being from being this little dwarf. In his first step, he takes back the earth. The second step, he takes back the underworld. In his third step, he takes back all of the heavens. Okay, and of course, Bali was fooled by him. But there's kind of a reconciliation at the end. Like I said, Bali, even though he's a demon, was kind of a noble and good ruler. So kind of a cool story. But anyways, you've got Purasharama, Rama with the axe. You've got the Rama, the one that we're going to focus on in the story today. This is the son of Dasaratha. So we're going to talk a lot about him, so I'll hold off on telling you his story. The famous god Krishna is a manifestation of Vishnu. Buddha. Now, Buddhism is a completely separate religion today, but it evolved out of Hinduism. It was a reaction to Hinduism, as a matter of fact. So Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, is viewed by Hindus very often as a manifestation of Vishnu. Okay, and then the future avatar, kind of this, I don't want to use the word messianic figure for the future because I don't want to, again, steal terminology from other religions, but it's kind of this future avatar, Kalki, who rides on this white horse. All right, so those are the 10, the Dasavatara of Vishnu. So let's now focus on the big one, which is Rama. Now, according to Tusidas, Vishnu and Rama have a particularly important place in his belief system, right? He's a Vaishnavite, but he's also a Bhakta of Rama. So for him, Rama, not just Vishnu is Brahman, Rama is Brahman. Rama is the ultimate. He's above Vishnu, okay? He actually would reverse things and say Vishnu is an avatar of Rama, not vice versa. So Rama is the ultimate, not an avatar of Vishnu. He's also the source of all avatars. And Sita, which is the wife of Rama in the story, if you haven't read it, you're going to be really well familiar with her soon. She is the avatar of the energy of Rama. Brahma is the reason of Rama. Vishnu is the intelligence of Rama. And Shiva is the consciousness of Rama. But everything goes back ultimately to Rama. And I know I'm giving you a lot of visuals here. I'm not really stopping to point them out. But this blue-skinned figure here is Rama. And that is Sita that is with him. Okay? Lakshmi, who you actually see on the left-hand side of the screen, is the wife of Vishnu, the consort of Vishnu in Hindu mythology. And she's a goddess of knowledge. Now, in the story of Ramayana, she's also manifest in the flesh as Sita. So Sita is an avatar of Lakshmi. And that's going to be true in, I think, most versions of the story, though I haven't read all versions of the story. All right, so that's a little bit of a background as to the place of Rama in various conceptions. So let's now talk about the principal characters. If you haven't read the story, I want you to read it, and I do need to warn you that the names are a little bit difficult if you're not from the culture or exposed to the culture. And there are some other things that may be unsettling about the story as well, which I'm going to kind of point out as we go through the major characters. You've got Rama at the top. He is the main character. He's the 7th avatar out of those 10 of the god Vishnu, and he's the son of a woman by the name of Kausalya. Now, his father happens to be the king of Ayodhya. Okay, that's Dasaratha. You would think when I say son of somebody, it's usually the father, but I want to mention the mother because she doesn't really show up very much in the story, but the father does. Anyway, Sita is the wife of Ram. And by the way, usually you don't pronounce the A on the end of some of these names, and I have a habit of doing that, so I apologize. So Sita is the picture of devotion. She is the manifestation of Lakshmi, the wife of Vishnu. So Rama and Sita, just like Vishnu and Lakshmi, they're together. They're married. She's the adopted daughter of a king by the name of Janaka, but she is the daughter of the goddess Mother Earth. Okay? And she was formed from the blood of the sage's sacrifice, and she's produced right out of the earth, and then she's taken in by King Janaka. And she's protected by this vulture, kind of her defender, known as Jatayu. Okay, so she's a very special character, and when I say she's the picture of the devoted wife, I want you to think about that idea of bhakti again, the idea of devotion. Is going to be an important theme within the story, as well as dharma. You've got the idea of devotion. Those are two big themes. Now, the king, Dasaratha, the father of Rama, is the king of Ayodhya. He's the father of a number of children, and he is a good man, right? This is a king who actually is admirable, unlike some of the kings we've looked at in the past. In particular, we can contrast him with Gashtas from the Shanama. Right, here's a king who offers a throne over and over again to his son Esfandyar and never follows through by giving it to him because he's too ambitious and fearful of his son. Not a man who keeps his word. Dasaratha, on the other hand, is a really great king who does live according to his word and his promise, and it ultimately does him in the story in a certain way, but he's a man of honor and a good, loving father who is more than willing actually to give the throne to his son Rama. That's part of the plot we're going to get to in a second. Now, the reason I'm going into this idea of how good the king is because one of the things that kind of grasps Western readers when they pick up the Ramayana, kind of like our conversation a little bit earlier about role models, is you're going to see a family here. Rama, his brothers, the different mothers, Dasaratha, incredibly close family, incredibly loving family. It's almost too good and hard to associate with, or it just doesn't sit right. We're used to the characters that we get from Western literature, like Heracles, like Gilgamesh, like Esfandyar. These are characters that make mistakes all over the place, right? They're flawed individuals, even though they model virtue in various ways. They never get it right perfectly. Yet in the Ramayana, you've got these characters that are almost too good to be true. And in a way, they make very good role models. Not that you can identify with them very easily, but they give you a standard that is really, really high, something that is really going to cause you to have to shoot for, right? That's just kind of out of reach. How do you ever live your life up to that standard? But again, the idea is they do live really according to Dharma, right? They're great examples of that virtue. All right, so I don't know, that kind of bothered me the first time I read it. I was like, these guys are way too nice to each other. Bharata. Bharat is the second brother of Rama. He's also an avatar of Vishnu. Here's a weird thing, is that all four of the brothers in this story are avatars of Vishnu. Now, there's different ways this could be viewed. They're not primary avatars. They're manifestations of a certain aspect of Vishnu. In some traditions, they're not avatars of Vishnu at all, but again, we're going with the Valmiki version. And Bharata is going to be a very important character. Out of the brothers, Bharata and Lakshmana are the two most important. Lakshmana is the companion of Rama. He's the closest to Rama. They're kind of like, almost like twins, though they're not twins. They're actually close as any twins could be. They do everything together. So he's devoted absolutely to his half-brother, Rama. And he's the twin of a further brother, which is Satrughna. Okay, Satrughna is the fourth and also another avatar of Vishnu. And Satrughna is to Bharata what Lakshmana is to Rama. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of words at you. One confusion, I should probably point it out now, is it's very easy to confuse Lakshmana, the brother, with Lakshmi, the goddess who is the wife of Vishnu. So try to be aware of that. There is a difference. Maybe you could tell the difference in the fact that Lakshmana has an M-A-N in the name, so you can remember that he's a man and Lakshmi is not. Perhaps. Okay, I'm just trying to give you a way to not get too confused. Anyways, other principal characters in the story. Kalkeyi, this is the mother of Bharat. Good woman, but she's going to cause a problem in the story, which we'll see very soon. Sugriva, who is the king of the monkeys, the monkey clan, the monkey people. They are kind of organized like a human society in the story, and they're going to be allies of Ram. Ravana, or Ravan, he is the demon king. He is our villain of the story, and that's actually him that you see in the picture. He is the demon king of Lanka, is multi-headed leader of the Rakshasa. Those are the demons. Okay, so he's our bad guy for this tale. Kumbhakarna is one of his brothers. This is the biggest and baddest of all the Rakshasa demons. He's a giant who basically spends most of his time sleeping because of some backstory that we don't need to get into, but he will wake up during the great battle at the end. And then another brother of Ravan is Vibhishana, and he is an example of why demons aren't always bad, because he is not just a demon. He's actually the future successor to his brother, and he's a successor because he ends up siding with Rama. He's basically someone who devotes himself to Ram. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting relationship. And then the most important ally of Ram in the whole story is his ally Hanuman. Hanuman is the great monkey hero who serves Rama and is a devotee or a bhakta of Raman. And he's also an incarnation of a god, but not Vishnu. He's an incarnation of the god Shiva. Okay, we'll talk more about his powers later. So let's get to the story. The boon of Brahma. This is a gift of the god Brahma to Ravan. Ravan was given protection from the gods by Brahma. The idea is he is invincible. He cannot be harmed. The gods cannot touch him. They're forbidden to lay hands upon Ravan. Now humans, not so much. The humans could, theoretically, harm Ravan, except for the fact that they're too weak to do so, which puts Ravan in a pretty interesting position where he apparently is, for all intents and purposes, invincible, invulnerable, like we've always seen, which means there's got to be some kind of loophole here. If the story is going to be interesting at all, there's got to be a way around this apparent invincibility. And that loophole is going to be found by Vishnu. So in the beginning of the story, you've got the incarnation of Vishnu. Vishnu becomes Ram, the avatar, for the purpose of dealing with Ravana. And he also incarnates again as the three brothers. And again, contains the ultimate essence of Vishnu. So this is the ultimate mission. He becomes Ram in order to deal with Ravana, because as Ram, he's not a god, but as Ram, he, in an incarnation or avatar of Vishnu, he's more powerful than the average human. So he's in the only position where he could do some damage to the villain. Okay, so that's kind of the setup. Now, the story is going to begin with, let's say, Rama being chosen for this mission by the sage known as Vishwamitra. Vishwamitra basically calls Ram to adventure by saying, you've got this quest to defend the world against the Rakshasa demons. And he's trying to find one of the brothers that is willing to do this. And Ram steps up. So we have our traditional call to adventure with the response by Ram. He doesn't seem to be hesitant to do this. He's more than willing to take the mantle of herohood upon himself. But he doesn't go right off into battle. Okay, so you can maybe look at it as somewhat of a refusal of the call in that he doesn't do it immediately, but he doesn't really hesitate the way you think a refusal would be. Now, we're also introduced very early on to his relationship with Sita. Now, Sita, again, he doesn't know her, even though she is the incarnation of Vishnu's wife Lakshmi. When they first meet each other, it's when Ram goes to visit King Janaka's kingdom, and they see each other from a distance, and it's basically love at first sight. Now, different people are trying to win the hand of Sita, and the way they do this is with a challenge to string the bow of Shiva. This is the god Shiva's bow. It's so big and powerful. The average person has no hope of even bending the bow to string it. But Ram comes along, and he takes the bow, and not only bends it and strings it, but he ends up breaking the thing in half. He's so powerful. So he wins the contest. And if that reminds you, maybe it should remind you, I'm not going to say if it reminds you, it should remind you a little bit, if you've read it, of the end of the Odyssey. Right? Here's another Indo-European tradition from Greece where you've got a hero who is winning the hand of a woman, in that case Odysseus trying to retrieve his wife Penelope, doing a contest that has to do with the bow. If you know in the end of the story, there are the suitors who've been trying to seduce and marry Penelope, who's been without her husband for about 20 years. And the contest that is set up is if anybody can string Odysseus' old bow and shoot an arrow through these axe heads, they're going to win Penelope as bride. And nobody can do it, of course, except for Odysseus, who's in disguise at the time. And he does it. And then he, again, turns the bow on the suitors and basically kills everybody to the man. Kind of a happy ending to the Odyssey. Anyways, very similar here. If there's some background culturally for this tradition, for this story, who knows? But it's still nonetheless interesting. Ultimately, there's a quadruple wedding. The different brothers end up marrying different women altogether. So Lakshmana, for instance, takes a wife, Sita's sister, I believe, at the same time. So just put that in the back of your memory banks there, that Lakshmana is married, because that's going to have something to do in a second with the plot. Anyways, back home, Dasaratha is waiting to give Rama the throne. The succession has been set up so that Rama will be the next king of Ayodhya. Rama's willing to take the role. Dasaratha's definitely willing to step down, but something's going to interfere with the succession, and that has to do with the mother of Bharata, Kaikeyi. Now, she's a good woman, and she's told by a corrupt servant named Mantara. She is told that Rama is out to get her son Bharat. Okay? And she doesn't believe this at first. She knows Rama. She knows all the boys. I mean, they've been growing up together. The entire family is very close, like I said. And she loves Ram just as much as she loves her own son, Bharat. So she really doesn't believe this at first. But once you're told a lie often enough, very commonly you'll come to believe it. And once the seed is planted, she starts to really worry. Maybe Rama is out to get her son, and she doesn't want that to happen. So she's going to call upon Dasaratha to fulfill a promise that he made to her years earlier. She had saved his life way in the back of the story, and he made a promise at the time, ask anything you want and I'm going to grant it to you. Okay, so she's crying in her room when the king happens to come by, and he sees her crying and wants to know, what's upsetting you? Why are you crying? And she basically tells him, grant that favor of me that you promised. And he, of course, is going to keep to his word because he's a man of honor. And she asks that he not make Rama the king, but make Bharat the king instead. In addition to that, send Rama away, send him into exile for a period of 14 years. That actually becomes kind of the model for the forest-dwelling stage in the life of a Hindu man, kind of the model of Rama. Now, the king doesn't want to do this, but, a word is a word, and he made the promise, so he has to fulfill it, which he does. It breaks his heart. Literally, he has to tell Rama. And interestingly, this is where we get the interesting reactions of the different people involved, and where we get an idea of, again, what it means to be somebody who upholds Dharma. When Rama finds out that his father is sending him into exile, he takes it with a really good attitude. If this is your will, Father, then I will obey your will and do my duty. I will live according to Dharma, and if that's your command, I obey. Essentially, very calmly. Okay? And he resolves himself to go into the wilderness. Then his own reaction, having been brokenhearted by this whole ordeal, he ultimately dies from the case. Now, Bharat, the other brother, who finds out later that he's been made king and successor to his father, is upset about it. He actually goes and chastises his mother, saying, you asked something that was absolutely inappropriate. This is supposed to be Rama's throne. I'm going to give the throne to him. And actually he goes out after Rama, catches up with him, and says to him, father is dead. Okay, because Rama actually left before his father died, but he says, father's dead, come back, take the throne that's rightfully yours. And Rama's attitude is, no, I can't do that, right? I made this promise, I have to obey, even if he's dead, the command is still in place. I'm going to do the 14 years of exile. And Bharata basically says, if you are going into the wilderness for 14 years, then I too am going to live as if I was in exile, even within the palace. I'm not going to, live like a king. He's going to stay within kind of a state of mourning this whole time without his brother. And then he takes Rama's sandals, and that's what the picture shows you, and he brings them back and he places them on the throne as a placeholder for Rama. He says, when you're done 14 years later, the throne's yours. You come back and you're king the way it ought to be. So again, these are brothers that love each other. You look in world history, you look in modern politics, it's almost like, brothers are willing to, rise up and, kill each other over the throne. That's what we saw with Aeson and Peleus last week with the story of Jason, right, and the Golden Fleece and a number of other stories. But this story doesn't have that. It's kind of refreshing, okay? Anyways, this is the moment where you have the separation, right? He's crossing over now into the wilderness, and the whole purpose is the setup so that he now is in the position where he can do battle with the Rakshasa. He's in the wilderness with the demons, and he's going to fulfill his ultimate destiny. So we crossed that first threshold, and we're now into the adventure, the initiation phase of the story. Now, in the wilderness, there are lots of Rakshasa, and he does battle on occasion. In the 14 years that he's out there, he does his task, he does a good job. Now, one day, one of the Rakshasa, a female Rakshasa, the sister of Ravana, her name is Shurpanaka, comes to where Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana are living. And by the way, I probably should have told you, Rama doesn't go alone into exile. Rama goes with Sita, tells her to leave, stay behind her. She doesn't need to go into exile with him, but she's so devoted to her husband. She's so in love with the man that she says, if you go into the wilderness and suffer, I'm going to go with you. All right, so again, remember, she is the epitome of devotion. She's supposed to be the role model in her own right, so you can kind of view her as a hero of the story as well. And then Lakshmana, the other brother, who is the best companion of Rama, goes with him as well to defend Rama and fight with him. So the three of them are in exile together, and they're living in a little hut. So along comes Shurpanakha, and she has a proposal for Rama. She is enthralled with the guy. I mean, he's impressive. And she says, I want to marry you. Might remind you a little bit of Ishtar approaching Gilgamesh after his adventures. And just like that story, Rama rejects her. He rebuffs her. But he tries to do it in kind of a nice way. He says, I don't want to marry you. As a matter of fact, I'm already married. You don't want to marry somebody that's already married, do you? And of course, he can point to Sita. And then he says, why don't you instead take my brother? You don't see a wife with him. Of course, he is married. It just happens that his wife didn't come to exile with him. So she then turns towards Lakshmana. And he, too, rejects her offer of marriage, insulting her in the process, saying, you don't want to marry me, kind of mockingly, says, I'm just a servant, right? I'm kind of beneath you. So both of them rejected her. And in her rage, she is going to try to get vengeance, right, for the insult, much like Ishtar. Of course, here she doesn't send the bull of heaven against Rama. She makes an attack directly upon Rama's bride, Sita. And Rama and Lakshmana can't stand by and watch that, so they do combat with Shurpanakha, defeat her, and then mutilate her. They cut off her nose, they cut off her ears, and then they send her home to her brother, okay, to teach her a lesson. Now, this isn't going to go over well with Ravan. Ravan wants his revenge, and his revenge is going to be partly the abduction of Sita. He wants Sita for himself, okay? She's beautiful, and he's powerful, so it's perfect. Now, part of his plan is to lure Rama away so that he can abduct her without anybody being the wiser. This is a little bit like Hades abducting Persephone, though I guess I didn't tell you guys that story, so never mind. Maricha, one of the Rakshasa demons who is able to shapeshift, as most demons can, is going to be the lure. He changes himself into this beautiful gold and silver deer, and he runs right by the little hut where they live. And Sita sees Maricha and says to her husband, you need to go after that thing. It's so beautiful. I've got to have the deer. And Rama, very suspicious from the get-go, knowing this, it's not normal for there to be a deer quite like this, thinks it's a Rakshasa, and of course does have to go after it. Again, not to catch it, but to kill it. So Rama leaves Sita behind, and he gives the task to Lakshmana to guard Sita while he's away. And actually says, you stay here and protect her, and Rama goes off in the direction of Maricha. Now, Lakshmana, let me figure out, well, anyway, go back to Maricha. So what ends up happening is Rama catches up to Maricha and shoots Maricha with an arrow, kills Maricha. But before Maricha dies, he's not only able to change his shape, but he's able to change his voice. And from a far-off distance, you can hear a very faint call for help in what sounds like Rama's voice. So Sita hears this call, help, help! I've been wounded. Come and save me, basically. And she believes it's her husband. And she tells Lakshmana, you need to go rescue Rama. Leave quickly and go. And Lakshmana hesitates because his duty is to protect Sita. But at her instigation, he eventually says, okay, I'm going to go stay here. And around Sita, by the way, is a ring that has been drawn, a magic circle of protection around where she is. And she needs to stay within that ring to remain safe. And off Lakshmana goes. Now, while the two of them are away, Rama, Lakshmana, Sita's by herself, and along comes Ravan. Now, his trick is to come in disguise, and he tries to lure her outside of the circle, which eventually he does. Sita leaves the circle. He's abducted. She's grabbed by Ravan and thrown into his chariot. Jatayu, that bird, that vulture, the picture I'm showing you here is basically Ravan, cutting off the wing of Jatayu, who's trying to defend Sita during the abduction and fails. Sita is taken away in this flying chariot all the way back to the island of Lanka, and the only people that see or witness anything are the monkeys, because Sita has the foresight to drop her jewelry from the chariot as she's flying over the jungles. And it's the falling jewels that kind of leaves a trail so that the people know where she's gone, or the monkeys at least know where she's gone. Word eventually gets back to Rama. Okay, now Rama is going to need allies if he's going to make an assault on Lanka, the kingdom of Ravan. Sugriva is one of the first to ally with Rama, This is the monkey king that I mentioned before. And one of the greatest warriors of Sugriva's people is the warrior Hanuman. Now, Hanuman is going to be given the initial mission to go to Lanka to gather information. Now, Hanuman's powers are interesting too. He's not just a monkey, and again, the monkeys are intelligent, so that's unique for monkeys, period. But he's special as far as monkeys go in the mythology because he has additional powers like the ability to leap thousands of miles. I mean, the story is that he tried to leap up into the sky and snatch the moon out of the sky. But he's able to leap from where they are all the way to the island of Lanka, which is basically Sri Lanka, the island off the coast of India. He can change shape, so he's going to use that ability as well. He also has the ability to tell or choose the time of his own death. So it's close enough to immortality, with the exception that he is going to have to die at some point. But again, these are kind of his toolkit. Now, the mission is to find out if Sita has been faithful. Sita has been living in the house of another man, so there's the question whether or not she's ever slept with him. So the implication is Rama is not going to mount a rescue mission if she hasn't been faithful to him. So he needs to find this out before he begins the quest. And Hanuman leaps to Lanka, changes his shape into a cat, and then takes position in a tree just above where Sita is sitting. Now, in comes Ravan, who is having a conversation with Sita about the fact that he is getting impatient. He wants her, and she has resisted him up to this point. So no matter how long she's been in his captivity, she has not touched him. She has not let him touch her. So Hanuman knows she has been faithful. And then, after Ravan's gone, he reveals himself to her and shows her the ring that Rama gave him that's actually shown in the picture here. So she'll know that he's actually somebody sent by her husband. So she actually, offers to kind of rescue her there, but she refuses to go with him, waiting instead on her husband's rescue. Kind of that's his duty to do. So now's when the campaign will be launched, the invasion of Rama and his army. It's basically another version of the descent. He's got to cross over to the island of Lanka, which again means crossing over the waters to a land of demons, where he's going to try to retrieve, the goal of the quest, which is his wife. So again, tantamount to the same thing we've been seeing all along. In the battle, I should probably at least bring out, this is where you're going to see Kumbhakarna, the great giant, wake from his slumber. His monkey army, Rama's monkey army, is decimated by Kumbhakarna, who just literally takes handfuls of monkeys and devours them whole in his mouth during the battle. Vibhishana, the brother of Ravan, ends up siding with Rama. And at the end, after this long, drawn-out battle, Rama kills Ravan. Okay? And that's the victory. He wins his wife back, right? Conquest. We've kind of come to the climax of the story as far as the adventure goes. And you think now we kind of have the resolution. We're going back to the return portion of the hero's motif. But before we do that, we have actually the most depressing part of the story. So what happens after Rama rescues Sita? And this is the thing that probably bothered me more than anything else when I first read it, and I think it bothers a lot of Western readers when they read it. He subjects his wife to a test. The testing is what's called the Agni Pariksha, and it's a test of fire. It's a test to prove purity and faithfulness. And the idea is he has Sita walk into a bonfire. Should she survive, it's proof that she is pure and faithful. Should she be consumed, it's evidence of her guilt. Now, why on earth would he make her do this action? Knowing, and this is the part that bothered me, he already knows that she's been faithful. Now, that was the whole mission of Hanuman in the first place. Yet he does this anyways. And you could think this might be some unjust action, that this is a failing morally speaking, or kind of renders him maybe less than perfect as far as a role model goes. But I think it needs to be an example, or understood as an example, of Dharma. Ram is a husband, and he's got a duty, of course, to his wife. But at the same time, he is also set up to be the king. He is the leader. He is the man who is responsible for more than just himself and his own family. And in doing this, it's a way that he is trying to show beyond a shadow of a doubt that his wife is pure for the good of the people that he will one day rule, essentially. So this is kind of an important thing for him to do. And you could also think of it maybe from the perspective that since he does know that she's pure, he probably assumes that she'll be fine if she enters the fire. Now, I think I'm speculating there, but I think there's a good chance and that's the case. She actually goes into the fire willingly, and she's protected. She actually is escorted right out of the fire by the god of fire, Agni himself, and her purity is proved. Okay? Incidentally, if you don't know anything about Hindu practice, there is a long historical practice conducted in India revolving a wife's duty at the death of a husband. Maybe I should say a widow's duty. It's called the practice of sati, where the widow will throw herself on the funeral pyre of the husband after his death. This practice in the culture is to cremate the dead, and often the ashes are deposited into the Ganges River. So a lot of times when you have these bonfires and these cremation pyres, the widow will literally jump onto the fire and go with her husband. Now, some have speculated that the story of Sita and her testing is related to that tradition, and maybe there's even a relationship between the name Sita and Sati, their practice. I don't know exactly if that's the case. I've heard disagreements with that theory altogether, but I'm just throwing it out there because it is interesting, right? This would be the idea of what's a devoted wife to do with her, deceased husband. A sign of devotion as you do this action. Now, of course, today, if you're not aware, it is illegal for that practice to be conducted in India. And it's been illegal since British occupation. So unfortunately, it still does go on. Every once in a while, you'll hear about somebody doing this. Even today, it shows up in the Indian newspapers. Anyways, she is reunited with her husband. Her purity is obvious, and you can now move on to a period of peace and prosperity. Right? The reign of Rama with Sita is going to last for 10,000 years. Right? This golden age. Everything is happy. He was given the throne just like Bharat said. He saved it for his brother. And another sad portion of the story comes in after the 10,000 years of peace and prosperity. And it happens to do with the people. The people of his kingdom start to gossip. There are rumors spreading around about Sita having lived for a time with Ravan in another man's house. And the people are worried that if Sita, the king's own wife, can get away with living in another man's home, then what are their wives going to think? They're going to think it's appropriate too, and we can't have that. So we need to make sure Rama deals with this accusation towards his wife's faithfulness. Okay, so maybe after 10,000 years, the public consciousness has lost memory of that original test, and there's a second test instituted. Now Sita ends up instead going to exile as kind of a way to avoid any kind of further penalty. So the rumors as to the queen's purity are kind of put aside. She has to be beyond reproach is the idea. So she is cast away. And the sad part is after 10,000 years of duty and faithfulness, even more than that because she's been with him all along, she goes off on her own, and she happens to be pregnant at the time with Rama's twin sons, who she will then give birth to in exile. Okay, so again, kind of a sad portion of the story, but there is not yet the conclusion. There's going to be kind of a happy ending. Now, in exile, she comes along to the prophet or the poet Valmiki. Valmiki is going to help raise the children of Ram, Lavan, Kusha, and teaches them the Ramayana, the song of their father. Eventually, when these boys are old enough, they come back to Ayodhya. They do combat with their uncles and Hanuman. They don't kill them, but they defeat them, proving again that they're the sons of Ram. Ultimately, Ram defeats them, and they are basically preaching while in the city the purity of their mother, right? And that's the whole idea, is they're there to be reunited or bring their mother's reputation back, which they do. The boys eventually sing the song to Ram. He breaks down, he recognizes them, and then there's a reunion with Sita. Valmiki reveals her in the end to the king. A test is demanded again, but Sita decides to just return back to Mother Earth. Remember, she comes originally from Mother Earth, and she goes back at the very end of the story as Mother Earth takes her away, and she ultimately becomes, once again, Lakshmi, okay, in her divine personage, leaving Rama to rule by himself for the rest of his life. And again, it's a peaceful reign, probably a lonely reign, but at the very end of the story, Ram himself goes back to the heavens as the god Vishnu, and is once again reunited with his wife Lakshmi, as Vishnu and Lakshmi originally were. So, kind of a happy ending, kind of a sad ending, kind of a mixed ending. And like I said, to a Western audience, that's often the most depressing part of the story. So let's kind of wrap up by taking a look at some of the themes here. Obviously, Dharma is one of the big themes. Rama, no matter the personal cost, is going to live according to the code that is set out for him. He's got a duty as a hero. He's got a duty as a prince. He's got a duty as a son. He's got a duty as a subject. And he's going to have a duty as a king. And he does an outstanding job at all of those levels in upholding Dharma. So the idea is Rama is a role model that you can look up to. You're supposed to learn how to live your life by observing him. But it's not just Ram who is the example of Dharma. It's the other characters around him as well. Sita, Lakshmana, Hanuman. They're all examples of Dharma. Now, the other side of the coin is, again, with Dharma, is not just what you do, but it's what you don't do, right? It's about limits. It's about boundaries. And this story has numerous boundaries, and it tries to show you the consequences of stepping over those boundaries. Right, when we talk about the hero's journey, we talk about the crossing of the first threshold, the whole initiation process. We know that when we cross over a boundary, it's the beginning of a transformation. When we get to the underworld test, right, it's usually crossing over a boundary as you go into the catabasis, whether it's the waters of death or, Styx as you enter the underworld. Whatever, it's also about transformation. Now, there are warnings, however, that need to be understood when it comes to crossing a boundary. Sometimes there are dangers involved. All these stories, there are dangers involved, right? Now, how this lesson comes across in the Ramayana is by showing what happens when people do things that bring them across some of those boundaries. And the idea is you should be content to a degree, because desire often leads to suffering. This is some of the great insights in Eastern philosophy and religion. Desire leads to suffering. Very much a Buddhist realization. Also a realization that you find in cynical philosophy back in ancient Greece, etc. So it's kind of a universal realization. Desire leads to suffering. Now, Kaikeyi, the mother of Bharat, is a great example of what happens when you cross a boundary. Here she is, who is a good woman, but she asks of her husband a request that she should not ask. Bharat himself even tells her what she has asked for was wrong. Yet, once she's transgressed, once she has gone across that boundary, and forced Dasaratha to fulfill his promise, problems emerge, right? It tears apart, in a way, the kingdom with the loss of Rama into exile. Of course, that's a setup for his mission, but nonetheless, she's crossed a boundary. She's done something inappropriate. Sita, too, in a way, transgresses a boundary. Even though she's the epitome of Dharma, she does cross outside of that circle of protection that was drawn around her when Ravana captures her. So what happens when you cross the boundaries? You're in danger, right? And that's what happens. She's abducted by Ravan. Lakshmana himself, he left behind Sita unprotected when he goes off to save his brother. Again, violating the promise that he made and the order to stay with Sita. He doesn't do that. So he does have a failing on his part, and it leads to the abduction of Sita as well. So again, you've got this theme of what's right and where you don't violate, right, the boundaries. Very important. The other theme, like I said, was also this idea of devotion, bhakti. Sita, Lakshmana, Hanuman, epitomes of devotion. People that love Rama are dedicated to him and devoted to him. And that's something, again, for Hindu people, it's important. Different, sects have devotion to different deities. We talked about Tulsidas, right? He was a bhakta of Ram himself. This picture that you see is a picture of Hanuman. Very common way to depict him, kind of tearing open his chest, a little bit gruesome. But what you're supposed to see is in his heart, right, inside of his chest, is Rama and Sita. Right? The idea of his devotion to them is the core, it's the center of his heart, the center of his love, his passion, and that's what makes him a good and devoted companion. Okay, so there's some pretty powerful themes that are going on in the story. Like all of these stories, you got to look at them for their moral lessons, for their character development, not just as an action-adventure tale. There's always more to that in a hero story. And even though the Ramayana might not be the type of story that we identify with as easily in the West, like I said, the character is a little too good to be true at times. I think you could still understand and get a lot of the benefit from the story as you enjoy it. So if you haven't read it yet, don't just rely on my retelling of it, because I know I left out tons of stuff. But go back, read it for yourself, hopefully enjoy it for yourself, and see what you think. So until next time, that will be it on the Ramayana.